My name is Eric Deakins. I was a Labour Member of Parliament from 1970 to 1987, and during that period, and both before it and after it, I have played a prominent part, or tried to, in the campaign to convince the British people that entry into and membership of what is now the European Union has never been in the national interest. The process began in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, signed by 6 West European countries which had tried to unite after the war in an iron and steel community, and it determined that that process of unification, economic unification, should be taken further. The founders of the community, the philosophers behind it, were quite clear about their ultimate objectives. Jean Monnet, one of the principal authors of the Treaty of Rome, told Douglas Jay, a British cabinet minister in the 60s and again in the 70s under Harold Wilson, that at the time, in 1957, they had taken a conscious decision not to set out their ultimate objectives for unification in Western Europe. They had decided that the people in each country would not support such an idea, and therefore they decided on a process whereby they would start with forms of economic integration, which would eventually lead to a form of economic union, and that would develop into forms of political integration over all areas of activity in the economy, and that would develop eventually into a political union. So there were 4 stages, of which the Treaty of Rome was just the first, and perhaps the most important. They argued solely for economic integration. Britain did not join at that stage, but subsequently, as the British economy seemed to deteriorate and Britain's influence in the world, particularly after the Suez Crisis of 1956, began to wane, they felt that there was a role for Britain in joining the common market as it then was, in order to get economic advantage and perhaps political advantage as well. In 1963, the United Kingdom Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a Conservative, decided that it was time to apply for entry negotiations into the common market. And he decided that there was to be no opposition. He thought the British people would take his word for it. The Anti-Common Market League, consisting of people like myself, was formed in 1961, because by 1961 it was quite clear that Harold Macmillan wanted Britain to join the common market. In March 1961, at the inaugural meeting of the Anti-Common Market League in Central Hall, Westminster, with the world's television there, because this was a momentous occasion, there were 2 Conservative MPs speaking, both Knights of the Shire, and I was there as the sole Labour, hardly representative perhaps, but certainly the only Labour person there, because I had been prospective and actual candidate against Margaret Thatcher in 1959 when she first was elected to Parliament. So the 3 of us spoke, and there was great interest in what we'd said. And I remember distinctly a report in the Times in March 1961 which said that Mr. Deakins had said that if this all went ahead, it would make the struggle over German rearmament in the Labour movement, which had occupied a number of the previous years, very controversial, seem like a storm in a teacup. And that was a quote in the Times. Nothing much happened after that, because Labour still hadn't made up its mind, and the Liberals, I think, were fairly in favour, that is, the Liberal Party at the time. In 1967, when the process of entry negotiations had been taken up by Harold Wilson, as a Labour Prime Minister, thinking it was time that Britain joined the common market. I was the Labour candidate in a notorious by-election in Walthamstow, in fact West Walthamstow in northeast London, which I lost by 62 votes in a small constituency, which had been solid Labour, one of the few Labour seats which had remained Labour even in the debacle of 1931, a seat that Attlee himself had held for a considerable time before retirement. In that campaign, I was restrained because my views anti-common market were well known, but I couldn't put them into the election address, which was written for me, as all by-election election addresses are done, particularly when it's a government seat at stake. And so I lost, and 500 votes went to an anti-common market candidate, which would otherwise, I'm sure, have come to me. However, that is just a personal thought, and that was just one of those things one has to accept. In 1970, I was elected MP in the same constituency. The Tory Edward Heath had won the election, became Prime Minister, and immediately started building on Harold Wilson's negotiations, which had been brought to a halt by General de Gaulle saying he didn't want Britain in the common market. But a new president in France, Monsieur Pompidou, had made it clear that given the right entry terms, he would probably agree, and so Ted Heath went ahead. The House of Commons and the Parliamentary Labour Party held a series of meetings, very important meetings, on aspects of common market entry, in which all the top people spoke both for and against. I played some part in those debates because I was, strangely enough for the Labour Party, an expert on agricultural matters, having spent 15 years working in agricultural marketing before getting into the House, speaking against people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams and others, trying to shoot down their arguments. However, the PLP was very split about the matter, and although there was strong opposition, we couldn't stop Ted Heath introducing the European Communities Bill in 1971 to allow us to enter. As a backbencher, I was added to the Labour front bench team. I'd only been in the House about a year, that were fighting the bill. The first day of the bill's committee stage was held up by over 8 hours of points of order, an absolute parliamentary record. And I was there the whole time, although I didn't actually feel the need myself to get up and raise a point of order, because the chairman of Ways and Means, which was going to guide the bill through the House in its committee stage, had ruled against the idea of amendments on major points of principle. Eventually, matters proceeded, and we had a situation in which a minority of the Parliamentary Labour Party and a minority of the Parliamentary Conservative Party consistently voted against their party's line. The Labour line was to oppose the bill because it was a Ted Heath bill. The Tory line was naturally to support the government bill, but there were people on both sides on the back benches, including a few ex-ministers on both sides, who strongly objected to the principle taken by their position taken by their own party. Sadly, there were more Labour rebels than there were Conservative rebels, and of course Ted Heath had a majority of around about 40. So even so, in many of the debates, there were very narrow majorities for the government. I can recall one late at night with the House baying for my blood because I moved an amendment on the Common Agricultural Policy on oils and fats, a very recondite issue and of no particular interest to most people at all. But we had a debate, and if you know the House of Commons when it's full and people have been in the bars and so on, there was constant interruptions, but we lost that debate by 5 votes. I don't think we had got nearer than that during the whole of that period. And that means that once the bill had passed, it put the Labour Party in a dilemma. And Harold Wilson tried to resolve that dilemma by committing the party to renegotiating the terms of entry, which Ted Heath had obtained and which were in the Treaty of Accession. Thereafter, in the run-up to the 1974 election, he made further commitments, that's Harold Wilson as leader of the opposition, and promised in the election campaign of February-March 1974 a referendum on the issue once the terms of entry had been renegotiated. That sounds very good, but in fact, of course, the Labour hierarchy, including Harold Wilson, were wedded to the idea of common market entry and wanted to window dress some issues on which they could claim that they had renegotiated entry on advantageous terms. I think the renegotiations were a farce conducted by Jim Callaghan, who was Foreign Secretary, and at that time I was a small junior minister in the Department of Trade, working with Peter Shaw, of course, who was an ardent advocate of no entry. And we worked together, and I criticised Jim Callaghan, and he was very annoyed and upset over my criticism of his position. Harold Wilson had realised there would be a split in the Labour Party, and in the Labour government, more importantly, unless he compromised. So for the first time on record, and I think the only time it's ever happened in parliamentary history, he allowed members of the government to take their own decision of principle as to which side they supported. The yes campaign to stay in the common market, and the no campaign to say that we should withdraw from the common market. I played a part, as many others did, in the campaign around the country, on television and so on. But the end result was that we lost by a 2-to-1 majority throughout the country. Now, that was very sad, but basically the referendum campaign was heavily weighted in favour of the status quo. The status quo was, we are in the common market, let us stay in. And it's much easier for people to support something which doesn't involve any major change than to vote for something which would have involved a major change by withdrawal. Enormous financial and media resources were available to the yes campaign. They were not available to the no campaign, which went along on, with very little financial support at all, but quite a lot of public support and a lot of loyal canvassers in the constituencies. The yes and no campaign sent leaflets to every household in the land, one for each side, and then the government sent its own leaflet out, which was arguing, saying, we've done very well, we've renegotiated properly, we've got what we wanted, please vote yes. So there were 2 yes leaflets to 1 no leaflet. And I think that that helped the final result of the campaign. What also helped was that Harold Wilson made a clear statement in his leaflet that went to all households that the danger of economic and monetary union had been defeated by what had happened in the previous year and during the negotiations. This was wishful thinking, if not a deliberate lie, and as someone who admired generally Harold Wilson, I would say it was probably wishful thinking. Subsequent events proved, of course, that economic and monetary union was on the agenda, and of course it eventually came about. Since that referendum, which was a major issue in British parliamentary and indeed national history, there have been more EU treaties, each involving further loss of sovereignty to Brussels. Each step has been part of a continuous ratchet effect, whereby once power has been ceded to Brussels, it cannot be returned. Majority voting in the Council is not, as the pro-common marketeers would claim, is not sharing sovereignty. It is actually loss of sovereignty. Gestures have been made involving more consultation with national parliaments, which is almost meaningless. And at no stage has there been any attempt in the EU's history, unless dictated by national constitutional considerations, to consult or involve the people of the European Union in the major decisions which have been taken on their behalf. The evolution of the EU has been elitist and bureaucratic, not democratic. Everything has been top down, not bottom up, as you might expect in a democratic group of countries. National elections have not been appropriate for considering EU matters. Only specific referendums have been able to do this. And on the 3 occasions when they were held in Denmark, France and Ireland, the electorates voted no to further EU developments and integration. 2 of those decisions were subsequently reversed by further referendums, which suggest one thing, that the EU cannot accept democratic decisions by the people and is forcing them to vote again and again until they vote the right way. That cannot be under any circumstance be considered democratic. And that is what the position we are faced with now, with the Treaty of Lisbon, which has not yet been ratified, with a second referendum coming next year in Ireland. I did play a small part in speaking over in Dublin on the eve of the previous Irish referendum on EU, joining the EU. That was lost, and I'm afraid that unless luck turns our way for once, it may be the next referendum will be lost as well, which would be a very poor prospect, because the Treaty of Lisbon is not the end of this process. There is not yet full economic union. There is not yet full political integration, but they're ultimately what people are still hoping for, although they keep quiet about it for the time being, is full political integration, which would mean the end of Britain as an independent country. Thank you.